How her boss regretted cheating with her. The rain drummed steadily against the office window, a rhythmic patter that seemed to mock the silence in the room. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the last of the paperwork into its folder, stealing glances at the figure seated across the desk from me. Mark. His presence filled the room in a way that felt suffocating now, though it hadn't always been this way. Mark Daniels, my boss for 3 years, was the epitome of charisma. He carried himself with an air of effortless authority, his tailored suits always immaculate, his smile disarming. At first, I'd admired him from a distance, taking note of the way he commanded respect without raising his voice, how his piercing blue eyes seemed to read people like open books. He had a way of making you feel seen, as though your opinions mattered in a world that often ignored you. But now, those same eyes bore into me, and I couldn't help but feel like a marionette with its strings cut. "Lena, you're distracted," he said, his voice low but tinged with impatience. "Are we going to talk about what happened, or are you going to keep pretending it didn't mean anything?" My stomach churned at his words. What did I think it meant? What did he think it meant? The questions had plagued me for weeks, ever since that night. The memory came flooding back unbidden, vivid and sharp. It had been late, long after the office had emptied, save for the two of us. Deadlines loomed, and Mark had insisted on staying to help. I should have known better, seen the signs. The way his hand lingered on mine when he handed me the stapler, the way his gaze lingered a second too long as I bent over the printer. At first, I chalked it up to harmless flirtation, something that came naturally to him. But when he leaned in that night, brushing a strand of hair from my face, I hadn't stopped him. Why hadn't I stopped him? "I can't do this," I finally said, my voice shaking. "Whatever this is, I don't even know who I am anymore." Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. For a moment, his confidence faltered, replaced by something raw. "Lena, you're overthinking this. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "We were drawn to each other. That's not a crime." His words made me flinch. Not a crime. He said it as though it were that simple. As though it wasn't a betrayal of his wife, of everything I thought I stood for. I turned my gaze back to the folder in front of me, the mundane comfort of paperwork grounding me. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. The weight of my guilt sat like a stone in my chest, threatening to crush me. "I made a mistake," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rain. "And I think you did too." Mark's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. "A mistake?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Lena, what we have was real. You can't deny that." I wanted to laugh, to scoff at his audacity, but all I felt was exhaustion. "And what about her, Mark? Your wife? Does she feel the same?" He stiffened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it was something, a crack in his polished facade. Revenge for betrayal. Mark's silence spoke volumes, but it wasn't enough. Not after what he'd done, not just to his wife, but to me. Betrayal had a way of seeping into your bones, twisting every fond memory into a weapon. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but instead I drew a deep breath and let the storm inside me settle. There were better ways to deal with this. Smarter ways. "Lena," Mark finally said, his voice softer now, as if he thought gentleness could undo the damage. "I never meant to hurt you. Or her. I held up a hand, cutting him off. "Don't," I said, my tone sharper than I'd intended. "Don't try to spin this into something noble. You made a choice, Mark. We both did. And now we have to live with it. But living with it wasn't enough for me. Not anymore. The ache in my chest, the shame that clung to my every step, It all demanded release. And deep down, I knew I couldn't move on without confronting the man who'd unraveled my life like a loose thread in a cheap suit. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a plan began to take shape. It wasn't about hurting Mark. Not physically, at least. It was about stripping away the lies he cloaked himself in and exposing the truth for all to see. It was about power. My power. Reclaiming it piece by piece. Setting the stage. The office holiday gala was 2 weeks away, a grand, glittering affair where deals were sealed over champagne and reputations were built or broken with a single conversation. Mark would be there, of course, playing the part of the charming executive, and his wife, Sarah, would be at his side, blissfully unaware of the man she was married to. I spent those 2 weeks meticulously gathering evidence. Text messages, emails, anything that painted the full picture of what had transpired between Mark and me. I wasn't proud of it, but pride had no place in war. And make no mistake, this was a war, a battle for my dignity, my self-respect. On the night of the gala, I arrived early, wearing a dress that hugged my figure just enough to make an impression without crossing into overt provocation. My makeup was understated but precise, my hair swept into an elegant updo. I wanted to look like someone who was in control, because I was. The room buzzed with laughter and the clink of glasses, but my focus was singular. Mark stood near the bar, his arm around Sarah's waist, his smile as effortless as ever. Seeing them together sent a pang through my chest, but I buried it deep. Tonight wasn't about pain. It was about justice, the unveiling. When the time was right, I approached Sarah, my steps deliberate, my expression composed. "Hi, Mrs. Daniels," I said, extending a hand. "I'm Lena. I work with Mark." She smiled warmly, her kindness catching me off guard. "Oh, I've heard so much about you," she said. "Mark speaks very highly of your work." I bit back a bitter laugh. "That's kinda him," I said. "But there's something I think you should know. It's difficult to say, but I believe you deserve the truth." Her brow furrowed, confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" I handed her the folder I'd prepared, every piece of damning evidence neatly organized. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is what your husband's been hiding from you." The color drained from her face as she flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. When she looked up, her eyes were glossy with unshed tears, but there was fire there, too. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking, and she turned to confront Mark. The scene that followed was chaos, a symphony of accusations and denials that drew every eye in the room. Mark's mask cracked, his carefully curated image crumbling before my eyes. And as I watched him flounder, a strange calm washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. A new beginning in the days that followed. The fallout was swift. Mark's reputation was tarnished beyond repair, his career hanging by a thread. Sarah filed for divorce, her strength in the aftermath a testament to her resilience. And me? I walked away from the company, taking a job at a rival firm where my talents were recognized without strings attached. But more than that, I walked away from the shadow Mark had cast over my life. His betrayal had broken me, yes, but it had also forced me to rebuild myself stronger, sharper. And in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all, becoming the version of myself that he could never control, never diminish. Sarah's perspective. The day the illusion shattered. I knew something was wrong the moment Lena approached me. There was a tightness in her jaw, a flicker of pain behind her polite smile. At first I thought she was just nervous, perhaps trying to make an impression. But when she handed me that folder, my world shifted on its axis. Standing in that ballroom, surrounded by the hum of laughter and clinking glasses, I felt utterly alone. Each page I turned revealed a truth I hadn't wanted to see. The late nights, the cryptic phone calls, the sudden distance between Mark and me. It all made sense now. I wanted to scream, to throw the folder in his face. But instead, I walked toward him, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The room seemed to hush as I approached, all eyes turning toward the drama unfolding. "Mark," I said, holding up the damning evidence. "Care to explain this?" His face paled, his usual composure slipping. "Sarah, I can—" "Don't," I snapped, my voice trembling with fury. "Don't insult me with excuses. I trusted you. I built a life with you, and this—" I gestured to the folder, my hand shaking. "This is how you repay me?" For the first time in years, I saw Mark for what he truly was, a man who thrived on control and deceit. The facade of the loving husband, the charming boss, it was all a lie. And as painful as it was to face that truth, it also set me free. Lena's perspective. Rising from the ashes, leaving the gala that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, guilt, and a lingering sense of uncertainty. I'd exposed Mark, yes. But what came next? Could I truly move on, or would this betrayal haunt me forever? The first few weeks at my new job were challenging, but they were also liberating. For the first time, I worked without the shadow of Mark's influence looming over me. My colleagues respected me for my skills, not for my proximity to someone in power. Still, there were nights when doubt crept in, whispering cruel reminders of my mistakes. On those nights I wrote. I poured my thoughts onto the pages of a journal, unraveling the tangled mess of emotions that Mark had left behind. Writing became my therapy, my way of reclaiming my narrative. A chance encounter. Months later, I bumped into Sarah at a coffee shop. She looked different, lighter somehow, as if shedding Mark had peeled away years of weight. She spotted me and hesitated for a moment before approaching. "Lena," she said, her tone cautious but not unkind. "Sarah," I replied, standing awkwardly. Look, I didn't mean to hurt you. I'm sorry for—" She held up a hand, stopping me mid-sentence. "You don't need to apologize," she said firmly. "You gave me the truth, and that's more than Mark ever did. I won't pretend it didn't hurt, but I'm grateful. In a way, you helped me find myself again." Her words caught me off guard, but they also filled me with a strange sense of hope. "Thank you," I said softly. "I didn't expect you to say that." We ended up sitting down, for coffee, sharing stories of our lives before and after Mark. It was strange, bonding with the woman whose life I'd inadvertently helped unravel. But there was something healing about it, too, a reminder that we were both survivors of the same storm. Lena's new chapter, as the months turned into years, I found myself thriving in ways I hadn't thought possible. I published a book based on my experiences, a raw, unflinching look at power dynamics and betrayal in the workplace. It wasn't just cathartic, it was empowering. Sarah, too, found her footing. She started a nonprofit organization for women navigating infidelity and divorce, using her own pain as a catalyst for change. Though our paths didn't cross often, we stayed in touch, each of us cheering the other on from afar. In the end, Mark became a distant memory, a cautionary tale rather than a looming presence, and as I stood on the stage at a conference years later, addressing a crowd about resilience and self-worth, I realized something profound. Betrayal had broken me, but it had also forged me into someone unbreakable. Lena's book. Unmasked. When I first started writing the book, it was more of a personal outlet than a deliberate project. Late at night, when the memories threatened to overwhelm me, I'd sit at my desk and write, pouring every raw emotion onto the page. At first, the words were chaotic, scattered thoughts and fragments of memories. But as the weeks passed, they began to take shape. The book, titled Unmasked, A Journey Through Betrayal and Power, became my labor of love. It wasn't just about Mark or the affair, it was about the systemic issues that enabled men like him to thrive and women like me to feel disposable. I explored themes of power dynamics in the workplace, the psychological toll of betrayal, and the path to reclaiming one's voice. When the book was published, I expected a modest reception, a niche audience of women who might relate to my story. What I didn't anticipate was the wave of support that followed. Reviews poured in, praising its raw honesty and the way it shed light on issues often swept under the rug. I was invited to speak at panels and conferences, my voice becoming a beacon for others navigating their own storms. Each time I shared my story, I felt a little lighter, as if the weight of my past was finally lifting. Sarah's nonprofit, Phoenix Rising. Sarah's transformation was nothing short of inspiring. After the divorce, she went through her own period of introspection, grappling with the betrayal and the life she thought she had built. But rather than letting it define her, she turned her pain into purpose. She founded a nonprofit organization called Phoenix Rising, dedicated to supporting women dealing with infidelity, divorce, and the emotional aftermath of betrayal. The name was fitting, a symbol of rebirth and resilience. The organization offered everything from counseling services to legal advice, helping women navigate the complexities of starting over. Sarah also hosted support groups where women could share their stories in a safe, judgment-free space. Phoenix Rising grew quickly, its reach extending far beyond what Sarah had imagined. Her personal story became the cornerstone of the organization, proving to others that it was possible to rebuild after devastation. A reunion of strength. 2 years after our initial meeting at the coffee shop, Sarah invited me to speak at a Phoenix Rising event. The theme was reclaiming power, and she insisted my journey was a perfect fit. As I stepped onto the stage, looking out at a sea of faces, I spotted Sarah in the front row. She smiled at me, her expression one of quiet encouragement. "Good evening," I began, gripping the podium. "My name is Lena, and like many of you, I've walked through fire. But tonight isn't about the flames. It's about what comes after. It's about rising." The applause was thunderous, the energy in the room electric. And as I spoke, weaving my story with the lessons I'd learned, I felt an overwhelming sense of connection. We were all phoenixes, every one of us, rising from the ashes of our pain. Afterward, Sarah and I shared a quiet moment together, watching as attendees mingled and exchanged stories. "You've done something incredible here," I said, gesturing to the room. "So have you," she replied. "And it's only the beginning." Looking forward, the paths Sarah and I walked weren't easy, but they were ours. We had taken the shards of our broken lives and turned them into something beautiful, something that not only healed us, but also inspired others. Mark, in the end, became a footnote in our stories, a reminder of where we'd started, but not where we ended. Because the true power of betrayal isn't in the hurt it causes. It's in the strength it forces you to find. The plan Mark's world revolved around 2 things, his reputation and his business empire. If I wanted to hit him where it hurt, I'd have to attack both. I started by reconnecting with old colleagues, those who had quietly suffered under Mark's oppressive leadership, but had never dared to speak out. With careful probing, I discovered a pattern of unethical practices, falsified reports, underhanded deals, and even harassment claims swept under the rug. One name kept coming up, Eric Carter, Mark's former business partner, who had mysteriously left the company years ago. I reached out to Eric, framing it as a chance to clear the air. Over coffee, he revealed the truth. Mark had pushed him out, using forged documents to strip him of his shares. Eric had wanted to fight back, but lacked the resources to take on someone as ruthless as Mark. "Would you be willing to revisit this?" I asked. "If I can bring you evidence and allies, Eric hesitated, then nodded. If you can prove it, I'm in. Gathering allies piece by piece, I built my case. Former employees, scorned business partners, and even Sarah, who had unearthed more skeletons during her divorce proceedings, all contributed to the growing dossier. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice for everyone Mark had wronged. Sarah and I became an unlikely team. While I handled the covert investigation, she used her network to connect us with journalists, lawyers, and whistleblowers. We're not just exposing him, Sarah said one evening as we pored over documents in her home office. We're setting an example. People like him need to know they can't get away with this. The public unraveling. The exposé broke on a Monday morning. The headline was damning. Corporate Kingpin's empire built on lies and exploitation, the Bay. Article detailed everything. Mark's unethical business practices, his mistreatment of employees, and even the affair that had catalyzed his downfall. Eric went on record, supported by the mountain of evidence I had compiled. Within hours, social media exploded. Investors pulled out, clients severed ties, and Mark's name became synonymous with scandal. Watching it all unfold, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction, yes, but also a profound sense of closure. Mark tried to fight back, of course. He issued a statement denying the allegations and threatening legal action. But the evidence was overwhelming, and his allies quickly distanced themselves. He called me once, late at night. "Lena," he said, his voice laced with desperation. "Why are you doing this? I gave you everything." "You gave me nothing but lies," I replied coldly. "And this? This isn't about you and me. It's about everyone you hurt. You deserve this, Mark." Lena's new chapter. The scandal marked the end of Mark's reign, but for me, it was the beginning of something new. I became a prominent advocate for workplace ethics, using my story to inspire change. Sarah and I remained close, our shared experience forging a bond neither of us could have anticipated. And as for Mark, he faded into obscurity, a cautionary tale in the corporate world, because the best revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. And I had transformed into someone who no longer needed revenge to define her. Mark's New World months had passed since the exposé turned my life upside down. I had retreated to a quieter life, away from the limelight, trying to rebuild from the ruins Lena and Sarah had left behind. Despite everything, I still had my wife, Vanessa, or so I thought. Vanessa had stood by me during the fallout, at least publicly. Her presence at my side during press conferences and legal proceedings lent an air of solidarity. But behind closed doors, things were different. The warmth we once shared was gone, replaced by cold detachment and sharp silences. I thought it was just the stress. After all, my world had crumbled, and hers had taken a hit too. But as time went on, subtle changes in her behavior began to gnaw at me. The signs started with her phone. Vanessa, once carefree about leaving it lying around, now guarded it like a secret. She started dressing differently, more carefully, more provocatively, claiming it was for her new job as a marketing executive. And then there were the late nights at work, the whispered phone calls, and the sudden excuses to meet friends. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was projecting my own guilt and failures onto her. But the doubt lingered, growing like a cancer in my mind. The discovery one evening, Vanessa left her laptop open on the dining table. I wasn't planning to snoop, I really wasn't. But as I walked by, a message popped up on the screen. "Sty. Night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My vision blurred as I stared at the name beside the message. Ryan. A young, ambitious co-worker of hers, someone I'd met at a company event. I clicked on the chat, scrolling through months of messages. The evidence was undeniable. Flirtations, stolen moments, promises whispered in the dark. Confrontation. When Vanessa came home that night, I was waiting for her in the living room. The laptop sat open on the coffee table, the incriminating messages displayed for her to see. "Explain this," I said, my voice cold and steady. She froze, her face draining of color as her eyes darted to the screen. For a moment, she said nothing, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. "It's not what it looks like," she finally said, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "Don't insult me," I snapped, rising to my feet. "After everything I've been through, after everything I've done to keep us together, you betray me like this?" Tears filled her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "I'm sorry, Mark," she whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for it to happen?" I laughed bitterly. "You meant it every time you texted him, every time you met him. Don't pretend this was an accident." Her confession as the night wore on. Vanessa confessed everything. She spoke of feeling neglected, of resenting the scandal that had engulfed our lives. She admitted to seeking comfort in Ryan's arms, claiming it was never supposed to go beyond a fling. But her excuses rang hollow. She had made a choice, a series of choices that shattered whatever was left of our marriage. The aftermath, I filed for divorce the next day. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic public fallout. This time, I had learned my lesson. Vanessa moved out, and I began the painful process of untangling our lives. The betrayal stung, but it also gave me clarity. For too long, I had clung to illusions of my marriage, of my power, of who I thought I was. The end, her betrayal, was another chapter in a story I'd been trying to rewrite. It forced me to confront my own failings and let go of the toxic cycle I'd been trapped in. A clean slate months. Later, as I sat in my empty apartment, I realized I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Betrayal, as devastating as it was, had stripped away everything false in my life, leaving me with the chance to rebuild, honestly this time. Because sometimes destruction is the only path to true freedom. The rise of Lena's masterpiece, after the public unraveling of Mark's empire, I could have stopped. Justice had been served, and the world now saw Mark for who he truly was. But deep down, I knew I wasn't done. The personal scars he left, on me and others, couldn't simply heal with time. I wanted my revenge to be a lesson, one that would echo beyond Mark himself. The next target, Mark, wasn't the only one complicit in the culture of exploitation. His inner circle, the enablers, yes-men, and silent accomplices, had thrived under his shadow. I knew their roles in covering up Mark's transgressions and ensuring his reign of terror endured. My attention turned to James Stanton, the COO of Mark's company, who had orchestrated countless underhanded deals to protect Mark and himself. He had been the one to bury harassment claims and falsify financial documents, all while maintaining an air of respectability. Exposing the network Sarah, and I pooled our resources, reaching out to investigative journalists and whistleblower organizations. Together, we unearthed a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Mark. Fraudulent tax filings, misappropriated funds, and unethical partnerships all pointed back to James and his cohorts. I approached the media with a carefully crafted story, ensuring that the narrative didn't just focus on Mark's downfall, but highlighted the systemic rot within the company. James Stanton's downfall. The story broke like a tidal wave, and James became the new face of corporate greed. While he initially denied the allegations, the evidence was overwhelming. Investigations led to lawsuits, and his personal fortune dwindled as legal fees mounted. It wasn't just about exposing James, though. This time, the goal was broader. By dismantling the power structures that allowed men like Mark and James to thrive, I hope to create lasting change. A personal letter. One evening, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unmistakably Mark's. "Lena, you've taken everything from me. My career, my reputation, my life as I knew it, it's all gone because of you. I don't understand how you could be so ruthless. But I suppose this is your victory. You've won. I hope it was worth it. I stared at the words for a long time. Part of me wanted to laugh at his audacity, his inability to recognize the harm he had caused. But another part of me felt empty. Revenge had consumed so much of my energy that I hadn't considered what would come after. A fork in the road. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by the fruits of my labor, news clippings, court documents, emails from supporters. I realized that while revenge had been my fuel, it couldn't be my destination. I needed to pivot, to channel my energy into something constructive. The world didn't need more destruction. It needed healing. Building something new. With Sarah's help, I founded an organization called the Phoenix Collective, dedicated to supporting survivors of workplace harassment and corruption. We provided legal aid, counseling, and advocacy, empowering individuals to fight back against systemic abuse. The collective grew quickly, attracting high-profile supporters and making tangible changes in corporate policies. For the first time, in years, I felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to Mark or the past. Mark's final act. Mark eventually tried to rebuild his life. He moved to a smaller city, started a consulting firm, and kept a low profile. Occasionally, I'd hear whispers of his attempts to return to the corporate world, but they always ended in failure. One day, I received another letter from him, but this one was different. Lena, I've spent years reflecting on everything that happened, what I did to you, to others, and to myself. I know I can't undo the past, but I wanted to say that I'm sorry for everything. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know. I folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer. It didn't erase the pain or the damage he caused, but it marked the end of a chapter. A new beginning. Revenge had been my starting point, but it wasn't my ending. I had turned pain into power, not just for myself, but for countless others. And as I stood on a stage at a Phoenix Collective event, addressing a crowd of survivors and advocates, I realized that the best revenge wasn't destruction. It was building a world where people like Mark and James could never thrive again. Because true power doesn't come from tearing others down. It comes from lifting others up. The quiet aftermath. The storm had passed, but the damage lingered. Mark's empire lay in ruins, his name forever tarnished. For a moment, I thought the satisfaction of seeing his downfall would be enough. But as the weeks turned into months, I realized the wound he had carved in me had not yet healed. His betrayal wasn't just personal. It had been an assault on my dignity, my trust, my very sense of self. Revenge had been sweet, but it wasn't enough. I wanted him to feel the depth of his actions, the echo of every hurt he had caused. A new path. I began to watch Mark's next steps carefully, almost obsessively. Despite his public disgrace, he hadn't disappeared completely. He had retreated to a modest life, far from the opulence he once flaunted. Yet I could see the threads of his ambition weaving anew. He was trying to rebuild, quietly, stealthily, in the shadows. He had started consulting for small companies, offering them his expertise in exchange for modest fees. It was a far cry from his former glory, but it was enough to spark something dangerous in me. I couldn't let him rise again, not without understanding the true consequences of his actions. The next move. I enlisted Sarah again, her expertise in corporate espionage proving invaluable. Together, we monitored his dealings, collecting data on his new ventures. Mark might have thought he was flying under the radar, but we saw everything. It didn't take long to find his Achilles heel, a risky deal with a tech startup that had questionable ethics and financial practices. Mark was walking a tightrope, betting his limited resources on a gamble that could either restore his fortune or ruin him completely. I decided to give him a little push. The trap posing as a potential investor I arranged a meeting with the startup's CEO. Using my connections and insider knowledge, I painted a picture of Mark as a liability, a man whose name still carried the stench of scandal. I subtly sowed doubt about his ability to deliver, emphasizing the risks of associating with him. Meanwhile, Sarah worked her magic, leaking documents that exposed the startup's unethical practices to a journalist we trusted. The resulting exposé not only cast a shadow over the company, but also implicated Mark as a key advisor in their dubious dealings. The fall, again Mark's fragile comeback, crumbled almost overnight. His clients abandoned him, unwilling to be tainted by association. The startup dissolved in scandal, leaving Mark with nothing but debts and a tarnished reputation. Again. This time there were no grand gestures of defiance, no attempts to save face. Mark seemed to disappear completely, retreating to an even quieter existence. A chance encounter. Months later, I spotted him in a small cafe on the edge of the city. He looked older, worn down by the weight of his failures. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. He noticed me too, his eyes widening in recognition. But instead of anger or bitterness, there was only resignation. "Lena," he said softly, his voice devoid of the arrogance it once carried. "Mark," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I suppose this is what I deserve," he said, gesturing vaguely at the empty coffee cup in front of him. "You've won." "It wasn't about winning," I said, my voice steady. "It was about making sure you couldn't hurt anyone else the way you hurt me." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time, I believed him. Closure. As I walked away from that cafe, I realized something had shifted within me. Revenge had been my driving force for so long, but in that moment, I felt it dissolve. Mark was broken, not just financially, but in spirit. He had paid the price for his betrayal, and while it didn't erase the pain he caused, it was enough for me to finally let go. I had my closure. Moving forward with the chapter of Mark finally closed, I focused on the future. The Phoenix Collective continued to grow, helping others find their voices and their strength. I found peace in knowing that my pain had been transformed into something meaningful, something that could change lives. Revenge had been the beginning, but redemption, my own and for others, was the end. The lingering echo of revenge months passed, and life returned to a strange normalcy. The fire of my anger had cooled, leaving behind the quiet ashes of reflection. The revenge I had orchestrated against Mark was thorough, a masterstroke of justice. But the satisfaction was fleeting. I had stripped him of his power, his reputation, his influence. But had I stripped him of the capacity to betray, to harm others? A new discovery one evening, Sarah burst into my apartment, a laptop tucked under her arm. "Lena, you need to see this," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of urgency and disbelief. She pulled up a series of documents, emails, and screenshots. Mark, under an alias, was attempting to partner with a shady offshore corporation. This wasn't just survival. It was the foundation of something potentially far more insidious. "He's not done," Sarah said. "He's trying to rebuild, using the same tactics, the same deceit." A wave of anger surged through me. After everything, after losing everything, he still hadn't learned. The next phase. This time, my approach would be different. It wasn't enough to tear him down. I needed to ensure he could never rise again. I reached out to an old contact, Detective Adrian Vaughn, who specialized in financial crimes. Adrian had a reputation for being relentless, and when I showed him the evidence Sarah had uncovered, he agreed to investigate. Simultaneously, I started building a narrative. If Mark wanted to rebuild in secret, I would shine the brightest spotlight on him. The double life exposed through Adrian's investigation, we uncovered a web of corruption involving not just Mark, but several high-profile players in international finance. It was bigger than I had imagined. Money laundering, tax evasion, and even ties to organized crime. I leaked the story to a prominent journalist, providing them with a treasure trove of documents. The exposé was explosive, capturing headlines around the world. Mark's alias was exposed, and his connections to the offshore corporation became the centerpiece of a global scandal. Mark's final reckoning, the fallout was swift and brutal. Mark was arrested, along with several of his associates. His face once again graced the front pages, but this time, it was alongside words like criminal network and international investigation. When he appeared in court, he was a shadow of the man I had once known. The arrogance was gone, replaced by desperation. He pled not guilty, of course, but the evidence was damning. Watching him from the gallery, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction, certainly, but also a profound sadness. Mark had been given every opportunity to change, to rebuild honestly, and he had chosen deception instead. The ripple effect. The scandal didn't just destroy Mark, it catalyzed a wave of reform. Governments tightened regulations on offshore dealings, corporations reevaluated their practices, and whistleblowers felt emboldened to come forward. My actions had set something larger in motion, and for the first time, I felt a sense of closure. That wasn't tied to revenge. A letter from prison months later, I received a letter. The return address was a federal prison. Lena, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write it anyway. You were right. I didn't understand the damage I had done, not just to you, but to so many others. I thought I could outsmart everyone, rebuild without consequences. Now, I have nothing but time to reflect. I'm sorry for everything. I hope somehow you find peace in all of this. I set the letter down, my emotions a tangled mess. I didn't know if I believed his words, but they didn't matter. The chapter of Mark was finally closed. The future of justice. With Mark behind bars and his network dismantled, I turned my attention back to the Phoenix Collective. We expanded our reach, offering training programs to corporations, advocating for stronger whistleblower protections, and creating spaces where survivors could reclaim their power. Revenge had been my beginning, but justice became my legacy. As I stood before a packed auditorium at a Phoenix event, I felt a sense of purpose I had never known before. Mark's betrayal had shattered me, but from those pieces I had built something unbreakable, and I knew deep in my heart that this was the ultimate victory. The second betrayal time had a way of smoothing over the rough edges of betrayal, or so I thought. After the whirlwind of accusations, apologies, and promises of change, I believed we were finally on a path to healing. Amanda had been steadfast in her efforts to repair what she'd broken. Therapy sessions, honest conversations, even giving me access to parts of her life she'd once kept guarded. But trust, once shattered, doesn't rebuild easily. I'd catch myself second-guessing her every word, scrutinizing every late-night message or work trip. Despite my efforts to believe in her, a small, nagging voice whispered doubts I couldn't silence. The signs it started subtly. Amanda had become distant again, her phone always within arm's reach, its screen tilted away from me. She began working, late more frequently, with vague explanations that never quite added up. At first, I convinced myself it was paranoia, an aftershock of the first betrayal. But the little things piled up. A lipstick shade I'd never seen before, unfamiliar names popping up in casual conversation, and that faint perfume on her scarf, a scent I knew wasn't hers. The discovery one evening, as Amanda showered, I gave into the gnawing suspicion and picked up her phone. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages, heart pounding so loudly I feared it might drown out her humming from the bathroom. And there it was, a name I didn't recognize. The messages were playful, intimate, and painfully familiar. Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing. Thinking about you. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. My breath hitched, and a cold numbness spread through my chest. I wanted to believe there was an explanation, some innocent context I was missing. But deep down, I knew. Confrontation. When Amanda stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, her face lit up with a casual smile that quickly faded when she saw my expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice hesitant. I held up her phone. "This, care to explain?" Her eyes darted to the screen, and for a moment she froze. Then the excuses began. Stammered denials, claims that I'd misunderstood, that it was nothing. But her face gave her away. The guilt was written. "All over it. You promised me," I said, my voice shaking. "You swore this would never happen again." Tears welled in her eyes, but they did nothing to soften the anger coursing through me. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the words felt hollow, like a script she'd rehearsed before. The breaking. Point this time, there were no promises of change, no grand gestures to win me back. I couldn't do it again. The pain of her betrayal had scarred me too deeply, and I knew that trying to salvage what was left would only prolong the inevitable. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're done." Amanda's tears turned to desperation, but I stood firm. For the first time in years, I chose myself over the illusion of a life we once had. Moving on, the divorce was messy, as divorces often are. But with each step, I felt a weight lifting. I began to rediscover parts of myself that had been buried under years of mistrust and heartache. Amanda's second betrayal had been the breaking point, but it was also the beginning of something new, a life where I could finally breathe freely, unburdened by doubt. The calm before the storm. After Amanda's second betrayal, I found myself standing at the edge of something darker, something I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, I wasn't just angry, I was cold, calculating. My trust had been shattered, and with it, any hope of a peaceful resolution. The wounds ran too deep, and this time there would be no apologies, no second chances. I had let her slip away once, but I wouldn't make that mistake again. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about regaining control, about making her understand the gravity of her actions. Revenge, a bitter brew. I spent the weeks that followed in a haze of meticulous planning. Every detail, every possible outcome ran through my mind. I wasn't going to just walk away. No. This time, Amanda would feel the consequences. And as much as the idea of hurting her pained me, I knew deep down that I needed this. I needed to make her realize the devastation she had caused. But the question lingered. How far would I go to make her feel the weight of her choices? I called Sarah. She had been a lifeline to me before, and I knew she understood my thirst for justice. "I need your help," I said when she picked up. "It's time to make sure she feels it. I need her to know what happens when you betray someone who trusted you completely." Sarah's voice was calm, but laced with a knowing edge. "I'll help you. You know I'll always have your back." The perfect plan. We began to piece together a plan, not of destruction, but of humiliation. Amanda had built her life on the facade of a perfect marriage, a perfect image. I knew she would never be able to withstand the public humiliation that came with exposing her secrets. Her reputation was everything to her, and now it would be the key to breaking her down. We started slowly, subtly. I hired a private investigator to dig into her financials, her hidden dealings, and any other skeletons she might have buried. We gathered evidence, leaving no stone unturned. The moment her secrets began to unravel, I knew it would be the perfect time to strike. The first blow. It happened on a quiet Friday evening. Sarah and I had arranged for a local magazine to publish an article, one that exposed Amanda's involvement with not just one man, but several. Her affair wasn't just a fling, it was a pattern of deception, a trail of lies that went far deeper than I had ever suspected. The article came with a splash of scandal, intimate photographs, love letters, even text exchanges, carefully curated to paint a picture of Amanda as the woman who had used her marriage as a cover for her infidelities. I could almost feel her panic from miles away. The fallout. The fallout was swift and unforgiving. Amanda's business began to crumble under the weight of the scandal. Her clients withdrew, her colleagues began to whisper, and her social media accounts were flooded with accusations and insults. The carefully constructed image she had spent years building had shattered in an instant. I watched it all unfold, a sense of satisfaction growing inside me as I saw her spiral. Her calls came, frantic and full of pleading. She begged for a chance, to explain, to fix things, but this time I was resolute. "No more explanations, Amanda," I said coldly when she called one evening. "You've had your chances. Now you get to live with the consequences of your actions." The final act. A month later, she reached out again, but this time it wasn't just an apology. She offered me something I hadn't expected, an admission of guilt, a final attempt to regain some semblance of control. "I'm so sorry," Amanda's voice trembled over the phone. "I never realized what I had until it was gone. I know I've ruined everything, but I want to make it right. I'll do anything, just tell me what you want." Her desperation was palpable, but it did nothing to move me. I had already gotten what I needed, her pain, her public humiliation, the closure I'd longed for. "I don't want anything from you," I said. "What you did to me, you'll carry that for the rest of your life." The quiet. After the storm. The weeks that followed felt like a hollow victory. Amanda disappeared from the social circles. She once dominated. Her once thriving career lay in ruins, and she became a ghost in the town she had once ruled. But even as I watched her fade into obscurity, a sense of emptiness lingered. Revenge had been sweet, no doubt, but it hadn't filled the void inside me, the anger, the hatred. It was gone. But in its place was something harder to define, a sense of detachment, a coolness that felt more like a burden than a relief. I realized then that revenge, while satisfying in the moment, didn't heal wounds. It didn't erase the scars of betrayal. It only carved deeper lines. A new path months passed, and I began to seek something different. Instead of focusing on what Amanda had taken from me, I started to look at what I could build for myself.